question that was asked at the, I think at the opening ceremony, and that is the why bother? Why do we bother with having protected areas? And I guess the management effectiveness evaluation process really goes to the heart of why bother. It's really trying to measure the extent to which we're meeting our aims. Today's campus is really looking at management effectiveness tools across the globe, and so we've got a really good mix of people from around the world, and hopefully there's lots of expertise in the room to share, and should be good. Really, the aim of the campus this morning is I guess, firstly to get a bit of a status report on what's happening across the globe in management effectiveness evaluation. Secondly, there's a whole range of tools that have been developed over the last decade, and so looking at some of the practical elements of implementing those tools. And there's some new innovations that have been developed, which will hopefully have some a bit more hands-on practice and discussions with. And also, just at the end, the management effectiveness program has really been evolving a lot over the last decade, and there's an opportunity for us to talk about where to next in the last part of the session. So the way that the structure of the campus will operate is we'll have an introduction first from Dr. Fiona Leverington. We'll then have what we might call speed presentations. So we're going to have 7 or so very short 10-minute presentations looking at management effectiveness tools and their application across pretty well most of the continents around the world. We'll then break into some small discussion groups to look at demonstrations and also talk about the application of those tools. And then we'll have a panel at the end to talk about the future. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Fiona Leverington to give us an introduction. And just before I do that, there are a range of publications and CDs available that people might like to take away with them. And Mark, where did you put those? Down the back corner over there? Okay, they're in the middle table. Let's not make this too formal. It's not meant to be a classroom. Hopefully it can be an interactive session. So I'll hand over to Fiona now to give a global perspective.
Shows that most of our countries here, and I know there's 1 or 2 major exceptions, haven't signed up to the CBD, but most of our countries agree with that because they have signed up to the target that talks about 17% of terrestrial and 10% of marine areas conserved through effectively and equitably managed protected areas. And it's that part of the Target 11 that our program is really being concentrated on. Countries continue to invest in new protected areas, and I've flogged that graph from the Protected Planet report that was released in the last couple of days. However, both the Protected Planet report and the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership show that in spite of the increase in protected areas, biodiversity is still declining. And it's certainly declining, at least in some protected areas. I would certainly argue not in a lot of them, but in some. And so the questions are increasingly being raised. Does this mean protected areas aren't working? Are they badly managed? Are they in the wrong place? Is it investment that's actually worthwhile, or are we barking up the wrong tree completely? Or is it that protected areas are working, but in spite of our best efforts, we can't hold the front of biodiversity decline? Certainly in the area I work in, though there's consistently high community support when we do community surveys for protected areas, I feel like we're under fire more than ever as protected area managers, including a lot of what I call friendly fire, so a lot of fire from papers published by scientists and comments made by conservation people. And those arrows are coming in so many directions at once, and our protected area systems tend to really suffer from them. So one of the big questions is, where is your evidence? People keep questioning things that I think have been very well proven, even that marine parks actually do work. It doesn't seem to matter what we say, we're continually questioned about our evidence, the costs of protected area systems, that we don't consider people enough, that we lock lands away. So we're still being called all the time to justify our existence. And so there is a very major role for management effectiveness evaluation of protected areas. Management effectiveness work's been talked about now for a couple of decades, and so I guess I've got a bit of concern that people will start to think, oh yeah, management effectiveness was the jargon thing, the buzz thing from 10 years ago, but actually it's more relevant than it ever was. Basically assessing how well our protected areas are being managed. So primarily we're looking at the extent to which the protected areas are protecting their values, that values are remaining, achieving their goals and objectives. And those goals and objectives are both biodiversity oriented and also socially oriented in terms of supporting communities. There's been a lot of discussion, and I'm sure it'll be raised later today, about what is management effectiveness and do we just measure biodiversity values. And there's been a lot of discussion about the relevance of the general management effectiveness work versus work that just measures specific indicators like deforestation and endangered species. And certainly we believe that it's extremely important that whatever the key values of protected areas are conserved. However, we also feel that it's important to measure other aspects of management, and these are all detailed in quite a number of documents. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but looking right across the management cycle. And the reason for doing that is that we believe strongly that to be effective, there's a whole lot of things that need to be considered. And I just looked at a picture of one of our female rangers conducting a burn and thought about, okay, to make fire management effective, what do you need? And there's all sorts of aspects of management that need to be considered. And if any of one of those isn't working, isn't there, then it's very likely that biodiversity is going to decline. So when Mark was doing his PhD, 15 years ago, he started looking at this question and came up with what we call the framework for management effectiveness, which is looking at all these different aspects of the management cycle to build an understanding of how management works. So if you do or don't have good outcomes, why is that so? What areas could be weak and where could we strengthen them? So it's much more than a simple academic analysis of, yes, this is stopping deforestation. It's looking into the causative factors and understanding how it works. So this WCPA framework, which is easily available from the internet, the second version was published in 2006. I've noticed even in that protected area Planet handout, there are both the old version and the new version are there, so it's worth them. They do have some slightly different case studies, but it's worth making sure that you get the latest version of that. In that, we identified 4 major purposes for management effectiveness, and many studies hopefully do all of them. So the first and probably most important one is to help us manage better. The second one's about reporting and promoting accountability and transparency. The third one's about helping us to allocate resources and prioritisation. And the fourth important one is about building a better constituency. And I can look around this room and quite a number of you have published reports that I think are fantastic in all of those aspects. And they certainly promote a park or a park system better than anything has in the past. Built on that framework, we have a lot of different methodologies. And at the end, I've got the website of the World Database of Protected Areas where all those methodologies are collected together. So these are built on the framework. They adapt it to different situations, different scopes and different geographic areas. And you'll be hearing more about the application of these and some of the other methodologies later on. What I'd just briefly like to talk to today is where we're at and where we might be heading to on 3 different levels that management effectiveness operates, because we're at an international conference here, but most of us have also sat down on the ground with park rangers and with communities looking at management effectiveness, and I'm quite interested in how those levels balance out and how they tie together. So the protected area level is very much about adaptive management and improving approaches. It's very relevant and very interesting to rangers and to communities and to park managers, but it's also interesting to park donors. So a lot of the early management effectiveness work was very much driven by non-government organisations, and some of that continues through World Wildlife Fund, TNC, and IUCN itself have all been big drivers in getting a lot of management effectiveness work happening, but also increasingly we're seeing institutionalisation so that park management agencies themselves are picking it up. And a lot of the assessments you'll be hearing about today are done at that protected area level. And there are some of the questions that are particularly relevant to park rangers. And to me, it seems like, how can you manage a protected area if you don't know the answer, or if you're not at least asking those questions? But it's amazing when we start to look at our protected area systems, how many park managers can't tell you whether the park is better off now than it was 5 years ago. If you don't know that, you really don't know very much about the protected area. And a key one, I guess, for the donors is that question about, have our investments been worthwhile? So, for example, the Global Environment Fund insists that any of their projects have a management effectiveness tracking tool done at the beginning, at the mid-stage and at the end of the project to give them some indication as to whether things are improving. The system level is something that we've started to look at more in a few years, and Mark's been a real driver for doing several of those studies, where a country or an agency or a group of protected areas look at how, as a system, how well they're functioning. This is also done partly in one of the methodologies called RAPAD that's been around for a long time, but we're trying to take it to a higher level. So there's 2 kinds of questions that are asked in system level assessments. One is rolling up the site level assessment, so you can say what proportion of our protected areas have good fire management, for example. But it's also looking at how the system or the agency functions, because I think what's happened a lot in the past, donors have put a lot of money into specific protected areas, but if the institution that runs them hasn't been built up in terms of its capacity and good policies and good legislation, as soon as that short-term funding finishes, it certainly goes down again as well. We also feel that doing that system level assessment can defend the system well against negative press and politics. So in my agency, I've just been through a very difficult process with the change of government and with a lot of criticism in the press, and we haven't had the lovely report saying, here's our state of parks. Actually, we're doing quite well. We know exactly what our problems are. We're on top of it. And if we'd have had a single document to throw at people, it would have really helped our cause. So I think that's extremely important. And those questions that the senior management and ministers need to answer, which is what gives us best to return to our investment, what makes the biggest difference, where should our money go, how should we allocate our resources, and be able to do that in a transparent and professional manner, again, gives a lot of defence for the system, as well as being more effective. The third level that I'd like to talk about very briefly is the global level, which is the one that we've also been a bit involved in. And I guess if I talk to protected area managers in the field and say we'd really like your data to be available for international reports to the CBD, they're certainly going to look at me blankly and say, what's the CBD? We don't care, we haven't put any effort into it. But getting those links are very important because, especially in a lot of developing countries, funding and activities are very much driven by the CBD targets. So the kind of questions that are being asked at that level are quite different, and they relate to international trends, how many protected areas have been evaluated, because part of the Target 11 action program is evaluating 60% of protected areas in every country. And to look internationally and say, are we making progress? Where are our main problems? Where are the gaps? Where should we be investing in the future? It's very important for international donors. The global study I mentioned briefly, up until about 2010, we compiled all available methodologies and data. I'm not saying there aren't big gaps, but we're always very happy to hear about the gaps. Unfortunately, we didn't continue to get any global funding for that work, so at the moment that's only been collected through volunteer effort, and we haven't been able to do updated reports. But the kind of figures that we're looking at the moment are, there are a small proportion of countries that have met that target, so that's in the green there. Quite a lot of countries haven't got any assessments that we can get hold of or that we know about, but a lot of them are on the way towards a 60% target. And that's just showing by country the studies that we have got into the global database. So one of the tricky things is some countries, and I think this especially applies to North America, there's obviously a lot of work that happens in assessing what's happening on protected areas, but it's not available in a digestible and put together form that we've been able to use. On the other hand, some countries, we just found out yesterday that South Africa's just done its entire park system. The people here from West Africa have done entire countries' protected area systems as well in the last few years. So some countries are up to 100%, some agencies are up to 100%, which is fantastic. Some have the only data we've got is from studies done by BirdLife International or a few scattered studies done by NGOs. And this one shows actually the location of protected areas that have been assessed. I've got to say Australia cheats a little bit because Great Barrier Reef is such a big area that we can include. So the green represents the protected areas and the red are the areas that have been assessed. As part of the global study, we also tried to think how we could combine a whole lot of data sets that use different indicators and different scoring systems. And we came up with a fairly simple methodology of just putting things on a 0 to 1 or 0 to 100% scale, where 0 means there's basically no management, so any question on assessment, they'll answer no, we haven't got it, we haven't done it, and green is doing really well. And we divided that into the bottom third, the middle third, and the top third, and as you would expect in any big data set, the cluster was around the middle, so we divided that as well into below the halfway mark and above the halfway mark, and that's called the basic group. There's going to be a video event today and more presentations on the 11th about the green list, and one of the things that IUCN is picking up strongly at the moment, and I'll talk a bit about that later, is the idea of a green list for areas that have gone into that green for all the aspects of their management. I won't go into detail about that at the moment. So the data that we had in 2010 showed about this picture, that we've got about 13% of protected areas across the world that fall into that really clearly inadequate, like really no effective management at all. Then most of it's in those two shades of blue in the basic, and we had about a quarter in the sound, and that's overall averages. So that's at least a rough picture of where we're up to. Still a lot of work to be done. And one of the interesting things about those scores is, while there was some difference between different continents, you can't say that developed countries are all green. So even in countries such as Australia and Europe, we have plenty of protected areas back in the blue and some in the red as well. From that data, we can also get some picture, and I'm certainly not going to go into this in detail, as to which aspects of management are doing best and which aspects of management are struggling most. So, not surprisingly, the aspects to do with planning and establishment are doing pretty well. Funding and a lot of the processes about communication and natural resource management are struggling. Our data showed that outcomes, which are in green there, about conservation of values, according to our assessments, were relatively strong. And the other aspect that we can pull out from the international work is overviews internationally and also in any region as to what threats seem to be most prominent. So there's actually a lot of important data that we can put together by getting the international information together. Some problems and challenges at that global level relate to the reluctance of a lot of agencies, especially to submit data and to be transparent. Some agencies will give it in a lumped up form, some are really reluctant to share it at all. So there's the